The judge scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer as he leaned back in his chair, arrogance dripping from his every word. "You think you know the law better than me?" he taunted, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every gaze locked onto the poised black woman standing before him. She didn't flinch, didn't waver, not even for a second. Instead, she met his condescending glare with an unwavering, quiet strength. Little did he know, she held a secret that would change everything. What happened next would send shockwaves through the room, leaving the judge questioning everything he thought he knew. The morning sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows of the Fulton County Courthouse, casting golden beams across the polished marble floors. The air inside crackled with anticipation, the kind of energy that only existed when lives were at stake. At the defendant's table, Angela Monroe sat tall, her back straight, hands folded neatly in front of her. Her deep brown eyes moved methodically around the room, taking in every detail, the smug smirk on the prosecutor's face, the hushed whispers among the spectators, and the steady but subtly judgmental stares from the jury. Beside her, her brother, Marcus Monroe, gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was a strong man, broad-shouldered, usually confident. But weeks of relentless accusations had stripped him of his usual assuredness. The charge of resisting arrest loomed over him like an ominous storm cloud, despite clear video evidence proving otherwise. Angela reached over, gently placing a hand on his. "Stay calm, Marcus," she whispered, her voice steady, soothing. "The truth always comes out. Just hold on a little longer." Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open, and an immediate hush fell over the room. Judge Bernard Witman strode in, his black robe billowing behind him as he moved toward his seat with an air of self-importance. A man in his late 60s, with a sharp nose, thinning white hair, and a reputation for being unyielding, often biased. It wasn't a rumor, it was practically a badge of honor among his peers. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his deep voice reverberating off the walls. Judge Witman settled into his high-backed chair, scanning the room with a look of disdain barely masked by disinterest. His eyes landed on Angela, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, as though he had already made up his mind about her. "Let's get this over with," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those in the front rows to hear. Angela remained unfazed. She had faced men like him before, men who saw her skin color before her credentials, who judged her appearance before they even heard her words. She had learned long ago to let their arrogance roll off her like water on stone. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, rose to his feet with a dramatic flourish, adjusting his tie as if preparing for a grand performance. "Your Honor," he began, his voice laced with confidence, "the evidence against the defendant is irrefutable. This is a clear case of blatant disregard for law enforcement, and no amount of excuses can change that fact." Angela's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue. She had promised Marcus she would let the lawyers do their job, even though every fiber of her being wanted to stand up and set the record straight. Reed continued, spinning a tale that painted Marcus as a violent, reckless man, a supposed danger to society. With every exaggeration, every twisted half-truth, Angela's stomach churned. When he finally finished, he sat down with an air of satisfaction, as though he had already secured his victory. Judge Witman turned his attention to Marcus's defense attorney, a young, nervous man who seemed to shrink under the judge's piercing gaze. "Well," the judge barked, his impatience barely contained. "Do you have anything to say, or are we just going to sit here wasting my time?" The attorney stumbled over his words, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela clenched her hands into fists under the table. This wasn't going to end well, not unless someone took control. As the trial progressed, Judge Witman's disdain for Angela became more and more evident. He interrupted her lawyer mid-sentence, dismissed valid objections with an apathetic wave of his hand, and even let out a smug chuckle when the prosecutor made yet another baseless claim. The room was suffocating under the weight of injustice. And then it happened. Judge Witman leaned forward, his bony fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. Miss Monroe, I suggest you learn your place in my courtroom, he said with a condescending smirk. Or, do you think you know the law better than I do? A charged silence settled over the room. Every eye was on Angela. She exhaled slowly, then reached into her blazer. A ripple of tension passed through the room. The security guard stiffened, ready to react, until she calmly pulled out a leather badge holder and flipped it open. The room gasped. The unmistakable emblem of the United States Secret Service gleamed under the courtroom lights. Judge Witman's smirk vanished. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He blinked rapidly, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. The confidence, the arrogance, it all drained from his face in an instant. Angela's voice was smooth, steady, but carried undeniable weight. Your Honor, she said, locking eyes with him, I am Special Agent Angela Monroe, United States Secret Service. I know the law very well. The silence that followed was deafening. The spectators stared in disbelief. The prosecutor's face turned ghostly pale, and even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably in his stance. For the first time in his career, Judge Witman had nothing to say. Angela let the moment settle before she spoke again. Now, shall we continue? Judge Witman let out an audible sigh, his fingers drumming impatiently on the desk, as Angela Monroe rose to testify as a character witness. Miss Monroe, he drawled, leaning back in his chair, his tone thick with condescension. I certainly hope you're not here to waste my time with sentimental nonsense. This courtroom deals in facts, not feelings. Angela met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm yet unwavering. I'm here to speak the truth, Your Honor, she replied evenly, her voice carrying the weight of her conviction. Nothing more, nothing less. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom, the tension thick enough to be felt. But the judge, with a single glare, silenced the whispers. He smirked, his mocking tone cutting through the air. Very well, he said, feigning indifference. Let's hear what you have to say. Angela stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Every eye in the room followed her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. But she didn't waver. Years of training had taught her how to maintain composure under pressure, and she wasn't about to let a pompous judge shake her. With clarity and confidence, she recounted the events leading up to her brother Marcus's arrest, painting a vivid picture of a man who had been unjustly targeted. But every time she tried to elaborate, Judge Witman cut her off, his tone growing sharper, more impatient. Miss Monroe, he said with a chuckle dripping in derision, you seem to think you're some kind of expert on law enforcement. Tell me, do you have any real experience in the field, or are you just another armchair activist? Angela felt a surge of anger flare within her chest, hot and immediate. But she swallowed it down. Now was not the time. Not yet. As she returned to her seat, the judge's laughter still echoed in her ears. She glanced at Marcus, whose knuckles had turned white from gripping the edge of the table. Leaning in, she whispered firmly, It's not over. Trust me, it's not over. Little did Judge Witman know. The woman he had so easily dismissed was far more than she appeared. And soon, the truth would shatter his smug facade. The energy in the courtroom was almost tangible, thick with tension, charged with unspoken words. Every tick of the grand clock mounted above the judge's bench seemed louder than the last, as if marking the countdown to an inevitable explosion. Angela Monroe sat still, composed, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within her. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but never ones so personal. Across the room, Judge Bernard Witman leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking under his weight. His expression carried thinly veiled contempt as he tapped his pen against the desk, a small but pointed reminder of his authority. He wasn't just dismissing Angela, he was challenging her very presence in his courtroom. All right, Miss Monroe, the judge said, his voice dripping with condescension. You've had your say. Now, let's return to the real issue at hand, your brother's blatant disregard for the law. Angela's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, her knuckles pressing against her thighs. Exhaling slowly, She recalled the mantra that had carried her through years of grueling Secret Service operations. Control the moment. Don't let the moment control you. Yet here, under the judge's glare, it felt as though she were walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, rose to his feet once more, straightening his lapel with the practiced ease of a performer stepping into the spotlight. His voice rang out, smooth and calculated. Your Honor, I believe we've had enough theatrics for one day. The evidence clearly shows that the defendant resisted arrest. Video or not, it's the officer's testimony that holds weight. Angela's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile threatening to surface. She had reviewed that same video a dozen times. It wasn't just clear, it was damning. The officer in question had escalated the situation, shoving Marcus without provocation, drawing his weapon over what should have been a routine traffic stop. But this wasn't just about the video. It was about power. Bias. The carefully spun narratives people like Judge Witman and Daniel Reed used to maintain the status quo. Angela leaned toward her brother, her voice barely above a whisper. They're pushing a story that won't hold up. Stay steady, Marcus. This is far from over. Marcus hesitated at the doorway, his fingers gripping the frame as he turned back to face Angela. His voice was low, thick with emotion. Angie, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for you. Angela stepped closer, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. You don't need to thank me, Marcus. You're my brother. I'll always stand up for you. She paused, her gaze unwavering. But what happens next? That's up to you. Use this freedom to make a difference, to be the man I know you are. Marcus swallowed hard, nodding. I will. Months later, Angela sat in her modest but neatly kept apartment. Documents sprawled across her dining table. The case against the arresting officer had gained traction in the wake of Marcus's acquittal, fueled by public outrage and the undeniable evidence presented in court. Activists, legal scholars, and even lawmakers had taken notice, calling for deeper investigations into systemic biases in the justice system. Angela had quietly stepped into a role she hadn't anticipated, an advocate. Not just for her brother, but for countless others wronged by a flawed system. She balanced her work as a Secret Service agent with her newfound mission, speaking at community forums, meeting with legal reform organizations, and lending her voice to the growing demand for accountability. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. Marcus. Hey, Angie, he said, his voice carrying a lightness she hadn't heard in years. I just wanted to let you know I spoke at a youth center today. Told my story. A lot of those kids, they're going through what I went through. I think it made a difference. Angela smiled, pride swelling in her chest. That's amazing, Marcus. I'm proud of you. You should have seen their faces, he continued, a hint of excitement in his tone. I told them what you told me, that the fight isn't over, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting. Angela leaned back in her chair, her heart full. You're doing good work, Marcus. Keep going. They talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. As the quiet settled back over her apartment, Angela let her thoughts drift. The road ahead was long, filled with battles yet to be fought, but moments like this reminded her why she kept going. Weeks later, Angela stood at the front of a packed auditorium. The bright stage lights cast her in sharp relief as she faced a sea of faces, community members, lawyers, students, and activists, all gathered for a panel on systemic reform. She hadn't been invited to speak as a Secret Service agent. Tonight, she was here as a sister, a witness, and a warrior for justice. Angela stepped up to the podium. The crowd fell silent as she began. Justice is not a guarantee, she said, her voice steady, but filled with conviction. It is something we have to fight for, something we have to demand. My brother's story is just one of many, but it's a reminder that when we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced, change is possible. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. This isn't just about Marcus or about me. It's about every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or wrongfully judged. It's about building a system that values humanity over bias, truth over power. The crowd erupted into applause, but Angela remained still, sweeping her gaze over the room. She felt the weight of her words, the responsibility they carried. And yet, she also felt hope, a quiet but persistent hope that things could change, that the ripples of this moment could grow into waves. As she stepped back from the podium, the applause swelled around her. Angela knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. She had found her purpose, not just in protecting others, but in standing up for what was right. And as the crowd rose to their feet, their voices joining in a chorus of support, Angela Monroe walked off the stage, her head held high, ready to face whatever came next.